we have been able to bring so many remarkable folks into this space, so many great conversations, expand all our minds here in this network that's been growing over the last couple of years here, and it really is all because of this really Capgemini. So we've got to give a great thanks, and I hope all of you kind of make sure you give gracious thanks to the Capgemini folks for making this happen. Part of what we've been able to do in this series has, we've had a bunch of different kinds of things we've done. One of which has been, we've had a little theme here of the launching some very important, interesting books. We had Facebook co-founder Chris Hughes. One of the first events he ever did was here on his new book, Fair Shot. We also did Neil Gershenfeld and his two brothers who did his latest book. He's the founder of really one of the fathers of the Maker movement and the Fab Lab kind of movement. We actually did their early book, and today we've got another one in that line with David Ewing Duncan and his new book here, Talking to Robots, Tales from Our Human Robot Futures. So we're in that space. Now, I would say what's interesting about this, there's many things interesting about this book. We are going to talk about the book. The book is essentially takes a wide variety of potential futures from many different fields and perspectives that goes out and explains the implications of AI and advanced robotics in these different fields. And he does it in a very entertaining, kind of fictionalized way. We'll get into that in a little bit here. So we are going to talk about the actual book on one level. But because we have the longer format here, and because we're actually opening it up to video and other different audiences from here and also to watch it later, which, by the way, if you want to help us out on that, we got the live stream here and the hashtag there if you want to do that. Where the live stream is. But anyhow, since we're opening this up to wider audiences, and since we can go deep, we're going to do a bunch of things tonight. One of the other things we're going to do is think of it this way, he went and talked to 30 bona fide experts, not just in AI and all, but in all these fields, who are at least aware of where AI and robotics was and how it could impact their fields. And he essentially interviewed them to kind of help him understand how he could tell these futures. But because of that, we'll be able to dial it back and also talk about, hey, what's really happening in these fields right now in the near term, what's happening now, what's happening in the next 5 years, and also kind of really down-to-earth country business implications for those that want to kind of more visceral, kind of near-term kind of look here. And the third thing about David is a bona fide expert himself, I would say, in the life sciences. Honestly, for the last 20 years, he is really one of the premier science writers in the whole space of life sciences, genetics, biotech. In fact, he is my go-to guy when I want to know something that's spot or actually understand who the heck is doing what and what's really smart to follow. It's really David I check into. And so even though this book is on AI and robotics, we'll actually be able to kind of bring into the story in this interview other big things going on in genetic engineering, all kinds of things that will be parallel kind of tracks essentially alongside this AI and robotics revolution. So it's going to be a very complex and interesting conversation. So the way we're going to start this, which is David's going to come up here, and he's going to give a little presentation, which is going to basically talk a little bit about the book, but he's also going to ask, there's a few questions in there that he's going to ask you folks that you folks might be able to interact with a little bit. I'll then come up with a little interview as usual and kind of get into some of these deeper spaces, and then we'll roll into a conversation with all of you, which is always some of the most fun part of the night. And with that, let's give a big what's now welcome to David Ewing Duncan.
All right, I'm so happy to be here. And any of you that have had anything to do with writing a book or a big project, you work on something for a couple of years, and it's really in your head, and then suddenly it launches, or a company launches. And so that's what's just happening with this book, and it's been very exciting. I would like to talk to you tonight about almost, I call it technophhrenia, with schizophrenia, about how we love and fear technology, and especially robots and AI. They can really apply to any technology, pretty much at any period of history as well. And we seem to be particularly technophrenic, if you will, right now, about how much we love, or we did anyway, love our phones, or we love the latest technology, and they're coming in very fast waves now. And almost by day we love them, especially entrepreneur and investors and things like that. You're all day pitching your new technology and how amazing it is. But there's also this fear aspect. And because you go home at night, after you've been pitching your company all day, and you watch Netflix and all these dystopic shows and films and all of this, right? And so, what's going on there? And so I'd like to talk to you a little bit about that. And the book is about 24 different kinds of robots, and I'll get to a couple of them here. But I wanted to frame it in this kind of big meta message about where we are. And as Pete said, I have the great privilege of being able to write about some of these new technologies and interact with some of the great figures and inventors and scientists and entrepreneurs who are actually developing these, mostly in life sciences. But in this book, I had to branch out a little bit. But I posed actually this question to them among many others. So I think that's a pervasive moment here in our current history. So I would like to suggest, or maybe propose, that along this idea of this sort of love-fear, that we in fact develop some sort of technology around this so we can actually understand why do we love, why do we fear, how much do we love, how much do we fear. So just, it's a little bit tongue-in-cheek here, but maybe an app would be a kind of robo-love-fear meter. And let me explain what this might be. So it actually would be a meter, and it would measure how much we love, which would be a +1 to +5, whatever the scale would be. And fear, -1 to -5. And 0 being neutral. So I'll pop to the +5 first, because that's what we're all hoping for, right? So robo-utopia. I think we got it.
You sure?
Yeah, technology, I love it. -5, of course, would be robo-apocalypse. So that's the best and the worst that could possibly happen as we're rating different technologies. And most of them right now are, of course, in their really nascent earliest phases. But I'll jump back to +1. I don't know, let's give Siri a +1, maybe, okay? But I would also give Siri a -1, because as we know, these different technologies that use voice recognition, they're pretty good for certain things. They're not so good for other things. And that could be across the board with all of them. And in fact, many of these technologies have both a plus and a minus. And I won't go over the rest of it here, but these are just some examples. Driverless car gets a +2 and a -2, because there's some real advantages to it. There are also some issues with it. And one of my favorite, the +3, Star Trek computer versus HAL 9000. So that's kind of a little tongue-in-cheek again, but it's serious in the sense that I think especially the people that make these machines don't think enough, and maybe it's not even entirely their job, but they should think to some extent about why they go home and watch dystopic, sci-fi at night while they're making utopic, or at least they hope utopic, technologies during the day. And we've never been very good as a species in considering the fear aspect or what might go wrong before things go wrong. But as these waves of technology are hitting us faster and faster, I would pose that we need to get a lot better at that. And as I said, I'm going to go through some of the robots in the book in this love-fear context, but I did want to place us in time here. And this is not a surprise to people in the field, but in the book I made up this term, early robot era, ERE, and in the future, where the book is actually told from the future. So they're looking back at our time, and they call it the early robot era. And that's somewhere way down at the beginning. And this is just one way we could evolve. There's lots of other ways. This is kind of a utopic evolution where we end up, being one with the machines and everything's great. It could go very differently as well. But the point here is that we're at the very beginning, and I'll circle back to that at the end. I also want to point out that this is actually a robot today. And most robots are robotic arms. They're mechanical bots that do mostly one thing. They might put a weld on a car door, or in the stuff I do in biolabs, they move around samples and they analyze samples. This is another aspect of robots today. This is Siri. It could be any other voice recognition, but this is kind of where we are, okay? And
Where we're not, unfortunately, but hopefully we will be, or maybe we will be. Although, I don't know, the enigmatic ending of this movie, who knows? Do we want to be there or not? But we are not there. Okay, I want to make that clear. Now, in the future, you'll have to kind of read the book. Do we get there or not? We're also not here, and I'm a historian by training, studied the history of technology, and it's so fascinating to go back in time on how different eras viewed the future. So this was a early 60s view, the Jetsons, where Rosie the robot would welcome George with a cocktail at night. I mean, and that was supposed to happen, by the way, a long time before the time we're living in right now. It hasn't happened yet. But that's not what we're talking about either. And then, of course, I have to throw this up here. This is the Terminator apocalyptic view. I actually don't think this will happen, certainly in the way where these machines turn malevolent. I think they'll just either wipe us out for no particular reason. I mean, they're not going to have us still around if they decide to go rogue like this. Or I think much more likely they're just going to ignore us. And like the movie Her, I mean, oh, thank you. Can you hear me? Okay. So I think it's much more likely that will happen. They'll just, I mean, as their brains get bigger and bigger, they'll just, we'll be sort of annoying, kind of like insects buzzing in their ears. So that's what it's not. So I'm going to go through a few robots here. And so just to expand a little bit on the basic structure of the book and how I've been thinking about this, each of the 24 robots in the book is reported from the present. So I'm a nonfiction journalist. And so fiction is somewhat new to me, but so I sort of cheated. I did both. So Politician Bot, for instance, I talk about what's really happening with AI in governments right now. And I talk to real people and real politicians. But that's kind of, there's a story wrapped around that that's fictional. And as I said, it's all told from the future by a narrator that it's not identified. Some people think it might be me, and that I've come from the future, but I will maybe reveal that someday, if that's true or not. But so Politician Bot in the love and fear context, we would love, wouldn't we love right now to have an AI system or a robot politician that didn't lie, that didn't have a big ego, that knew all the data and could kind of just do the right thing. Wouldn't that be great? We would love that. And it's very alluring to think about that. The fear, of course, is Big Brother, which in fact is beginning to play out in some culture or some countries around the world where AI is being aggressively used to do what happened in 1984 in George Orwell's book, but might be more like 2024 or 2034. You just got the year wrong. So anyway, we hope to avoid this. We would love to have more something like that. And as I said, I've been reporting this in the present, and it's fascinating to really go through and spend time researching this, looking into it. But if you can believe it, 25% of Europeans in a recent poll want to have AI controlling their governments. And Germany was the highest at 43%. So go figure. And of course, you have people saying, I don't know if it's somewhat hopeful, somewhat scary to people writing about this, but maybe AI will be the end of government as we know it. And there was an interesting moment when President Macron at France held an AI summit last year, and he called AI not a technological revolution, or as much a technological revolution as a political revolution. And what he meant by that is our basic government structures in the West were formed in the 18th century, and it's questionable whether a democracy can keep up with the pace of change and technology right now. We all know it's a very sloppy form of government. It's deliberative, it takes a long time, and when decisions need to be made quickly, in a sort of AI-fueled technology, can that even survive? So it's a time to automate politicians. There's a lot out there right now about this. This is one of my favorites, though, because Sam in New Zealand is actually going to run for high office in New Zealand in 2020. And there were a couple of robots that actually ran for office in the last, say, 2 to 4 years, including for the mayor of Tokyo. That robot lost, but we can expect that to continue. Now, Pete mentioned we're going to have some questions for you all. So I hope you're ready. I've been talking at you for a few minutes here. So we've been running a survey, which I hope we can get. I don't know how you all signed up, but if we can get you the survey, the publisher and I are hoping we get at least several hundred people taking this. It's just kind of fun, but it opens up some of the questions posed by the book and by this issue. Would an advanced AI system be better than a human serving as president of the United States? So how many would say yes?
We don't have one serving now, so.
Well, it's funny you say that, because in the book, there is a certain president who is a robot, but I'll just leave it at that. Anybody yes? A robot rather than a human? Okay. A few people. Okay, and I guess everybody else is no, right? But put your hands up. You got to be on record here.
Wait, the nose?
Yeah, the no, yes. Okay, so you'd rather have a human. All right. So that's pretty much the way the survey so far. We've had about 50 or 60 people take this so far. And like I said, we're going to be playing this out, but I thought I'd put up at least the preliminary results. But that's pretty close to what we just voted on. Okay, how about a DocBot? And this is more in my field. So AI and health and health data is more my field. But what we would love is to have a robot that's not only up on all the latest diagnoses and diseases and how to treat you, but also is empathetic and all the things that when you really need a human to touch you or hold your hand or tell you it's all right. I think it's hard for us to imagine a robot doing that, but if we were going to go this route, that's what we would want. We want the whole package. And I have a lot to say about that in the book, by the way. The fear is that you'll have just some, basically video screen on a stick, which in fact exists right now. That does exist. And please turn around and bend over. You have 12 seconds to comply. So it all becomes very, very regimented. And the odd thing is that with humans running the system right now, you get some of this too. So the question is whether robots would do a better or worse job than we're doing right now. Again, this is a big topic that's been out in the news a lot. Speculating on when AI or robots might take over or beginning to take over. And this is a fun one, this article, although it was in a fairly obscure publication. 15 medical robots that are changing the world. And I've gotten to see a lot of these, and some of them are really amazingly impressive, like some of the surgical robots that are much more precise where they need to be than a human who's, even if they're really steady, they're still going to maybe shake a little bit. A robot will not do that. And then on and on about how AI is showing promise. And I know a lot more about this field. We can talk about it later, but so far the AI experiment has been marginally successful, I would say. It's still pretty old-fashioned industry, and it probably should be. I mean, this should be one of the last because it is our lives at stake and the lives of our loved ones. So, would you be okay if a robot replaced your human doctor? Yes? Okay, a few more. Might have something to say about your doctor, but okay, and then the no's. Okay, how many people didn't vote either way? Okay, a few. Okay, well that's fair enough. Yeah. Yeah. Well, you would want Dr. McCoy and whatever machines he has, right? That's kind of the perfect combination. So again, I think we were pretty close here in the room to what's been in the survey so far. There's some fun chapters in the book, just some really short ones. This one of them is called Coffee Delivery Bot, and it's a story of a woman in the future who's waking up in the morning and she summons a bot, and it's a lot like Uber. So you summon it, it comes in a drone, and you're getting reports on how many minutes away it is, and so we would love to have that, right? Wouldn't you love? You don't even have to get out of bed. You just summon it, and in this case, it's CoffeeBot Fred. He's only 3 minutes away, and suddenly, though, CoffeeBot Fred gets stuck in a drone jam, and he's 17 minutes away. Oh my God! And by the way, we've forgotten in the future how to make our own coffee, so you have to basically wait for CoffeeBot Fred. And then we love it because Coffee Fred has arrived unexpectedly early, not 17 minutes. And so The problem here is, though, that you were so stressed out while you were waiting for Coffee Bot Fred that all your biometrics started registering stress and anxiety. So when you got there, Coffee Bot Fred uses his biometrics. And by the way, this is a real device. This exists right now. This drone with biometrics. And it tells you, I'm sorry, you're too stressed. You can't have any more caffeine. So anyway, those are some examples of robots. And I wanted to throw up here where the publisher, which is Dutton, which is part of Penguin, has been kind enough to hire an illustrator, and we're working on some pretty cool images of some of the different bots in the book. And by the way, the book is somewhat whimsical. Finally fell off. Okay. The book is somewhat whimsical, just so you know, and so we try to capture that in some of these drawings. But we talked about Politician Bot a minute ago. This is a cartoon we've come up with. I cannot tell a lie, I have no ego. What could possibly go wrong? And then there's, of course, a Sexpot in the book. And by the way, there's a warrior bot, a journalism bot, a thriller writer bot. It goes on and on. And towards the end, we have Immortal Me-Bot. We have a synthetic Me-Bot, which is, robots are not all going to be mechanical. Some of them are going to be synthetic or biological. So this is Sex Intimacy Bot. Robot Love is Complicated. This was a difficult one because I didn't do the illustrations. And they were sent to me to come up with captions, so I hope you like that caption. So Godbot is one of the last chapters. And there are humans, as I call them, human collaborators in each of the chapters. And this was Brian Greene. So I went to people like Brian Greene, the physicist, Kevin Kelly, a number of other really interesting, David Baldacci did ThrillerBot. And I asked these humans, what robot would you like to meet in the future or be afraid of meeting, and why? And some of them I kind of shaped like I was hoping David would talk about a thriller robot, which he did. Some of them, though, went completely crazy on me. Like Kevin Kelly did Teddy Bear Bot. And I don't know if you know Kevin, but he's a great futurist writer. And Teddy Bear Bot basically raises our children in the future. But the question around that one is, who programs Teddy Bot? Is it the government? Is it the company that built it? Is it you? Is it some political party? So anyway, Brian Greene came up with this robot that he was desperate for actually. As a theoretical physicist, he's trying to figure out the secrets of the universe. The beginning, how it began, how it will end, everything in between. And so as we're talking, and he's getting more and more excited about this robot that would be able to tell him all these secrets, we kind of both decided this was sort of like a godbot. And this is not the religious God, but godlike in the sense that it would actually know pretty much all the secrets of the universe. So ask me anything, really I know everything there is to know about the universe. And I love this artist rendition. That one's a little spooky, because Godbot, I think, would probably not look like that. But anyway, that's her interpretation of it. And by the way, having a Godbot that knows everything about the universe allows Brian suggested this, that if we knew all of that, the whole idea of time being linear would probably disappear. So we'd be able to know, or at least have some knowledge, if not exist in all times at once. And so in that future, which is kind of a cool future, we come up with timeliners. They're like starships, but they travel through time and space. And so I got to have some fun with that, and Brian again helped me come up with some of that. So just a couple more questions, and then we'll get to our chat. And can robots and AI be trusted to make ethical and moral decisions? So what do you think, yes or no? Yes? Can they be trusted? I know. By the way, these are intentionally just straight ahead questions. They're not giving you any caveats. So you have to sort of imagine, if you believe that AI can be trusted, you have to imagine that we'd have the technology to do that, because we don't really right now. But someday maybe. So you're free to imagine or not imagine that. If you can't imagine that, or you can't believe it, then you would vote no. So anybody yes? Interesting, okay. No, how about the no's? Okay. Any non-votes? Abstentions? Okay. So again, pretty close. I'd say this is a little more on the no side, maybe in the room here, but I find this absolutely fascinating because right now they can't be trusted. There's no way. I mean, they aren't designed that way. I mean, in some cases we're designing into them some specific ethical or moral, functions around whatever they're doing. For instance, automated warfare, and there is a chapter in the book called Warrior Bot, cannot take lethal action without consulting a human first, or at least that's what they tell us. So that's, I guess some sort of moral or ethical programming. Of course, you're leaving it up to a human at that point, so do you trust the human? One more question. Are you optimistic or pessimistic about the future of humans in the coming age of robots? So how many people are optimistic? Okay, let's say about half. How many are pessimistic? There's another, actually, third answer here, which is depends on the day. And you can vote again if you want. How many people are there? Depends on the day whether you're optimistic or pessimistic. Okay, so that's how this came out. Not many. I mean, by the way, almost everybody that was asked this, most of them are technology people, and they tend to be fairly optimistic about technology. So as we spread this out and talk to a lot of different people, it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. So finally, one of the things, as a writer and a historian that fascinates me is how we humans are trying to build machines to do things that we don't understand about ourselves. Like if you think about a sex or relationship bot, or even a warrior bot, or pretty much any of these robots, when you start getting into human emotion, we're still trying to figure out relationships ourselves. We probably always will be. Can we actually program that into a robot or a computer or AI system? There are people trying to do that. So it's fascinating. So robots, I don't even get humans. And then finally, going back to the early robot era that we're living in, the ERE, we are right now on the cusp of having a lot of these very powerful robots. In some cases, they're really here, in at least in the beginning stages. And it's a scary thing for us in this generation we're living in, or the next maybe generation or two after us. We are building the base code. We're writing the base code. We're basically setting the foundations for this coming age of robots and AI. And we have a gigantic responsibility to make sure to future generations that we do this right. And I'll leave it to you whether you think we're doing a good job on that. So, Love and Fear, and that's the book that's here tonight. It's also out in Britain with a slightly different title, much different cover. And I want to thank you.
All right. Hey, the folks that came in late, there are a couple seats over here if you want to move over this way. So, David, we're going to push you there and put me here. And could we switch that back? That's all good. And the last little bit here is balance your beer, so you can kind of have a beer if you want that. Or water, however you want to think of it. I think that's mine and that's yours. Folks, those questions are interesting. I took a larger survey with him, which you didn't include some of those questions in there. And I must say, as a guy who's very pro-tech and very open to, the future and very optimistic, they were really difficult questions. I mean, some of them here, I think I could see everybody here kind of wrestling with them. But there were a couple that were you didn't put in there that I would just want to throw out there, which was, one was, would you be interested in enhancing your body or intelligence in more in a synthetic way to actually become, start augmenting yourself to the point of actually moving towards robots, essentially, or some kind of thing. And I honestly was really wrestling with that. Another one was, how would you actually want to download your brain? Again, these are things that, could take 50 years, could take 30 years, however we think about this. But in the space of many people's lifetime, this is gonna, it's possible, potentially.
would you want to download yourself into a robot that the brain of the robot would be your brain and you'd be essentially a robot or enhanced? And it seems kind of wacky, but it's also, you think about it, and it's really an interesting fundamental question that is really something. And I don't know how people here would react to that, but these are the questions that we're really getting that are so fundamental about these things that it's a different thing than just saying, hey, do you like a smartphone or not? I like a smartphone. These are things that are really about what it is to be human, to what extent are we going to enhance ourselves, to what extent are we going to augment ourselves, where do you draw the line? So I don't know, you want to talk a little bit about some of those other questions you were pushing there too?
No, absolutely. I mean, it's partly how far would you go if these technologies existed, but synthetic biology, again, in the early phases right now, but it's conceivable that we've already got some gene editing. It's in clinical trials right now. I wrote a piece last year for Wired on the first human genome that's going to be completely synthetically made. In other words, every letter in the DNA is going to be constructed in a lab, which has never been done before. And you can rewrite the code, the entire code. It's not just edits. And as we move on in time, we're all going to have choices like that. And the questions in the survey were, how far would you go? But it's so interesting because if everybody's doing it, are you going to do it? And there's a chapter in the book called Homo Digitalis and Homo Syntheticus. And in the future, in this fictional story there's a big day, and it's called the choice. And each of us has to choose if we're going to go digital. In other words, we're going to download ourselves, digitize our thoughts and everything in our brain and the essence of who we are, into a computer or a robot, or we're going to go synthetic. And this is because the galactic government has decided everyone should get this because only the rich got it before. So there's been this huge push to give everybody this, but it's mandated you have to decide. And you can opt out, but you get penalties because you also don't want to leave people behind. So that's, in a sense, almost like a survey. It's like trying to make people think about how they would choose. And humanity ends up going about 50-50 with this. But there are a lot of people that think that both of these technologies will exist. So partly it's the biosynthetic where you stay human. And by the way, the two humans in that are Juan Enriquez, who you might know, especially from TED Talks. But he is desperate to digitize himself because he wants to go to the stars. And right now, with radiation in space and some other problems, biological material is not going to survive to go much beyond. Probably even Mars is going to be a challenge. It's one of the biggest challenges of going into space. So he would love this technology, and he's an investor, and he's investing heavily in this. The other human is George Church, who some of you may know, one of the top geneticists probably in the world. And he's the guy whose lab I wrote about last year in Wired, building a synthetic human genome. So these technologies are in their very early stages, but the question is, how far would you go, especially if it was safe and worked?
One of the things about the book, which I encourage you all to read, but you caught it in his discussion here, or his little intro, is it gets way out there, and at some point you sit there and go, oh, this is just too weird. It's like never gonna, we're not going to have AI politicians necessarily, or we're not going to have, download our brains. On the other hand, it really does, the extreme storytelling makes you think about it in a different way. And then almost all the stories, just to make clear here, kind of get dialed back also. And there's a kind of a sense of, by thinking extreme in all these directions, extreme positive and extreme negative, it kind of makes you kind of realize that the early questions we're dealing with here do have big implications. I mean, is that kind of why you did the extreme? Because it was like, some of them are way out there. But
yeah, I mean, the thought experiments. And, they're probably far, I mean, we aren't going to have a choice where everybody has, maybe we will, but I doubt it. But the idea there is to just make you think if you did have a choice like that. But I would argue that if you were, transported here from 100 years ago and saw some of the things that we're having, that we're dealing with now, like climate change, who would have guessed that human activity, and I hope you all agree it's human activity, would have caused this, this incredible crisis that we have right now. I mean, that's pretty far out there. I mean, nobody was thinking about anything remotely like that, probably even 50 years ago.
yeah.
And I mean, again, studying the history of this is so fascinating because people freaked out getting on a train that went 20 miles an hour in the 1820s. I mean, that to them was like just so far out. If you had told them
Yeah.
50 years earlier that they were going to be on something that went 20 miles an hour, they would never have believed it.
Yeah.
So, you know, I do get a little extreme, but I'm not sure that I'm even extreme enough given some of the crazy stuff we're already doing.
Totally. Now, we're going to have some questions a little bit here, so I do hold questions here. But let's talk of a few other things here. Again, think about it this way. Every one of these stories, too, has a kind of a real world, very concrete thing we got to think about right now. And you have to kind of read between the lines to get them, for example. So, for example, he mentioned this teddy bear bot. And you'd think, okay, a kid would have a little teddy bot, and the bot would be a security thing, because you could, you know, if something happened, the parents could figure out or would be alerted on it. It would be able to teach basic stuff, and a human couldn't just be immersed all the time. It would make the kill. Anyhow, you could react to the kid. But then you really start thinking through the implications of that. And I think you touched on this programming thing, but it's like, you know, how many different parenting styles are there? Or how many different nuances of, like, would you want to teach them what? You know, where do you draw the line? And is it a religious one? Or is it a, you know, kind of organic kind of framed worldview? And how do you adjust that? And it kind of makes you get right into the fabric of what we're dealing with right now in all these early systems, which is they are getting programmed. We are making very core structural choices around these things, and they're going to potentially have long-term implications. I don't know, do you want to talk a little bit about how that programming thing is we're at right now?
Well, part of what this is about, and the thing that fascinates me is something I mentioned, which is we don't understand a lot of how we work as humans. And you know, we all have different ways we think about raising our children, and it's very complicated why we do it. Some people are more strict, some people are lenient, some people are religious, some are not. I mean, it goes on and on and on. We haven't had to think, I mean, it's complicated enough, but we haven't had to think beyond our own beliefs about our own children and how our society weighs in. And to actually program this into a very powerful AI system that looks like a cute little cuddly teddy bear, but is actually going to be taking care of our kids and training them and entertaining them and, you know, making sure they're safe. And, you know, we have to, in a way, understand ourselves a little bit better to be able to program them. And, you know, will there be a world consortium? And this, by the way, not just teddy bots, this a lot of, you know, any of these robots or AI systems that are going to interact with us at a personal level, like a doc bot, or even some of the writer or creative bots. I mean, you know, how do we help them understand things we don't entirely understand about ourselves? And, you know, in that particular story, it does go a little south. I mean, most of them do, by the way, because that's a pattern in technology. When we love it for a while, then we see some downsides. It's happening with social media right now. And then we get confused, and, you know, should we regulate it? You know, what do we do? And that's where the fear aspect comes in. And usually in the past, we have figured out how to regulate it. I mean, you go back to the discovery of fire, people were probably scared of it, and pro-fire, anti-fire. You go all the way through technology like that. And we're going to be doing that, but we've never had a moment like this, where these machines are going to be so intimate into our lives and how we think about things. And we're going to have to question our own beliefs in some cases.
Totally get it. And I think it's a fun read in that you're kind of seeing these little bots in these extreme forms. But it makes you realize that every single field almost, maybe, I don't know, what do you think about this, is going to be impacted by this. Essentially, that's kind of the meta lesson of this thing. There's the warrior bot. Well, AI, and because you start, all those stories start in the present, essentially, or sometimes they give a little history, but it's essentially start in the present, and then you start riffing out further. But I don't think there was one of these fields that there wasn't really something realistically happening that was starting to really get traction. Is that true, basically?
No, it's true. In fact, well, I mean, maybe when you get into Godbot or towards the end. But yeah, I mean, that was part of the point of the structure of the book. And actually, they all start in the future. There's usually a little kind of almost intro So, because again, the narrator is from the future, and he, she, or it gives you a little bit about what's going on in the future. This kind of sets it up. And then you go back to the present, which is, to this narrator, is the past. And that's where you get into the nonfiction part, and you meet whoever the human collaborator is. And then, once you kind of, I try to help you understand what's happening in the present with these technologies. And all of them do have a present. I mean, they're all here to some extent, or at least people thinking about them. And then it moves back into the fictional story and the future on how it did turn out.
One of the things he doesn't have, what he has is, it's never clear where we are in the timeline. I mean, where we are, I guess, is true, but the stories can go way out there. Maybe 100 years, 1,000 years sometimes. I mean, you never know. But
13 billion.
Yeah, okay, well, but I mean, but in the realistic story that you're talking about here, which you've been reporting for like 2 years now, roughly, where is your kind of 5 to 10 year horizon? How much change do you think you're going to see in these AI technologies affecting us in that kind of decade kind of lens? You have a way to quantify that or discuss it, or you think it's still maybe it's a 30-year horizon that we should be worried about? Because there's a lot of discussion around job disruption and all kinds of stuff. Is like, when is it all going to hit in a really obvious way? Do you have thoughts on that?
Honestly, I do, and I think many of the big themes that we are afraid of right now, and people are writing a lot about. I mean, it's funny. Again, there's cycles. People tend to get excited, and there's all this hype, and then there's a hype-fear cycle that happens often before the technologies even arrive. And sometimes there's different people that are hyping it, and different people that are saying, "Whoa, wait a minute." But that's happening, and certainly in my field, and health data and AI right now, there is a raging debate, especially physicians who, strangely enough, don't want to be replaced by a robot, and they never thought they would be. They're highly educated types. But some of the issues around job replacement, I mean, it's sort of odd to be talking about it when we have such low unemployment right now. But then you have to sort of dig a little deeper, though. Many people have jobs they don't like, and they're different than the sort of jobs in the past that may have been very difficult, but you got paid a little more, like if you're working at a factory, and people having to work 2 or 3 jobs. And so it gets very interesting, this whole idea of automation, because the jobs are still there, which suggests they will be there for a little while. I mean, Amazon's hiring humans like crazy, but they're working alongside robots that one day, probably in a fairly near future, will begin to replace them and already are replacing them. So, I think we probably are, it's going to move both slow and fast, but we're not going to have radical changes in a 5 to 10 year time frame in most cases. I'm trying to think of one where there might be.
Well, the journalism bot, both of us coming out of that field, I mean, there are bots writing stories all the time right now. I mean, but there'll still be a level of high, sophisticated journalism that I'm assuming will be around for a while.
Well, that's a good example. I mean, you all might be surprised. Even I was. Most major publications, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, et cetera, they do have AI systems. First of all, they help the humans, collect data, which has been a revolution actually across the board. I mean, the idea that sophisticated computers can now feed you information. I mean, most of us use Google and all of that, which, by the way, hasn't changed all that much since it began, which is a story unto itself. These big tech companies kind of invented something 10 or 12 years ago, and they just kept it fairly static, and they buy up anybody that tries to innovate outside of, which is an interesting issue that's slowing down potentially the innovation. I think we have to look probably in 25 to 50 year framework. 50 years from now, there will be radical changes, I think. Driverless cars is another example. About 3 or 4 years ago, it looked like driverless cars were going to be happening pretty much the next week. My field of media loves to hype these things. It sells copies of whatever, e-copies these days. But it turns out that technology isn't really quite ready yet. And I've been down to Arizona. I've ridden in these things. Legally, you still have to have a human in the car. And there's still some real issues around that, not only in the basic technology of how it works, but how do you integrate that into a city? How do you integrate that into a highway or street system? And the issue of replacing human drivers is a huge issue. And I have one of the chapters in the book is called "Hello Robot Drivers," and that takes place in the future where every driver loses their job within a short period of time. And there's riots, and there's about 200 or 300 million drivers in the world, professional drivers. And I think that's one of those cases where we probably need to think that out a little bit. And in the chapter, in the distant future, basically this group of very smart people who are all women, by the way, they decide, you know what, you boys, stop playing with these toys over here. We're going to come and let us design this. And they do what they should have done all along, which I believe is really the solution to a lot of this, which is using machines to augment us and to help us and to be alongside us with things, but not replace us, except, it will have to happen in certain areas, but that shouldn't be the goal. The goal should be to actually integrate. And so anyway, that's kind of a fun chapter. But
Well, I will say, almost all of them have this kind of extreme backlash, or not all of them, but it goes extreme. There's some backlash, there's some kind of moderation, there's some kind of augmentation hybrid kind of solution in the end. Not all of them end happy endings, but that's kind of where you seem to be going. I mean, is there kind of a meta thing you're trying to say here, which is let's program these early to essentially be augmentation devices, not replacement devices? I mean, is that one way to think about it?
yeah, and that's a raging debate, and it's been going on for several decades, actually, since artificial intelligence as a term was coined in the 50s. And there's another term, which is augmented intelligence. And we don't hear about that as much, but that, in fact, is mostly what engineers are designing now. And driverless cars, yeah, they are trying to replace drivers, but like I said, it's not going to happen anytime soon. And I don't think legally they're going to be allowed to have a car drive itself for a very long time. There's been like 3 deaths, which, by the way, is interesting because compared to the fatalities of humans driving, that's pretty good. But if you take the amount of miles driven by humans and by robots, it's, I don't know, it'd be interesting. I haven't done that analysis, but it'd be interesting to see.
I think it's still low, though.
Is it lower?
Yeah.
But again, you have a human on board. I mean, everything happens. And there's still, engineers out there probably know about the cat problem. And that happens all across the board, including in driverless cars. Well, computers still have a hard time identifying a cat. And this could be anything, but because most systems, I mean, machine learning is changing this and some of the deep computing, but you have to actually show it every cat, like millions of cats, for it to identify a unknown cat. And they've mostly fixed it now, but for a while there, it would, you show it a skunk and it would say, well, it might be a cat, probably is a cat. And you go, no, it's a skunk. And then you'd show it a child, and sometimes it identified it. So driverless cars have had that problem too. There's some things that it just simply doesn't identify properly. And especially when the light is off, there's some environmental factors that weigh in there. So that's when I say it's not happening as fast, it's still really difficult to program a computer to have that sort of broad knowledge that our human brains have today, the moment we're born. And people talk about general artificial intelligence, which is what we have. I mean, I can be up here on stage, but I can also be, in the back of my mind thinking about something else. If I'm playing chess, unlike, Deep Blue, I'm thinking about other stuff. And, we have a lot going on in our brains. And, it's going to be a long time before AI really is able to do that. I mean, decades, at least.
You thinking of ideas here for questions and comments here shortly, because we're getting to that point. But that is something I wanted to ask you, because you've spent the last 20 years really in the life sciences, neuroscience, genetics, and all that. He's also writing a book right now with Craig Venter, who was the private sector side of the whole Human Genome Project race in the early days. But here you shifted to AI and robotics. I'm interested in just why you did that. And also, when you look at those two kind of fields, because there's kind of an info tech hardware version, and then there's a kind of a software, wetware kind of world. How do you compare the two, or how do you kind of relate the two, or how do you kind of, which is more interesting almost to think to you?
Well, I cover these technological changes and how it impacts us as humans. So it wasn't that hard of an extrapolation because in some ways I think biotech and biology and some of the synthetic biology is going to have a lot more profound changes more quickly than some of the AI.
Say more. Why do you say that?
Yeah.
Actually, just before
Maybe because I do know a little bit more about it, but AI is much more diffuse for one thing. And it's also machines. I mean, if your computer breaks down or crashes or something, that it really annoys you and you get upset. But you're not going to die, at least mostly for most of what we use computers for. But in medicine, it's really it's life and death and disease, and so these technologies, there's a vast amount of money being spent on them, and a lot of it wasted. But I think we're on the cusp of, like, say, gene editing. I mean, it's taken a while, and again, it went through the hype and fear cycle. It probably has another couple of hype and fear cycles to go. But you're actually editing genes in humans right now under FDA trials. And I think if those work, these things tend to move fairly quickly, once they work, even though it's taken probably an extra 10 or 15 years or 20 years, probably longer, than people thought it would. So I don't know if that answered your question, but.
No, that's helpful. But okay, so if you had to advise people in the audience here, who are all coming from interesting fields themselves, so you actually think the life science, genetics, biotech side is going to have a larger and a quicker impact on what's happening than essentially the AI robotics kind of impact and timeline? It
depends on what you're talking about.
Well, I get that, yeah.
But the life science, it's very focused. We are very focused on it because it's our health. And there's a huge amount of money being spent. I'm just about to start an article on, there've been in Alzheimer's, there's been a massive failure for the last 10 or 12 years for Alzheimer's disease. And, the pharmaceutical industry has spent tens of billions of dollars based on a theory about plaque buildup in the brain, and that causes Alzheimer's. Now, plaque does cause a lot of the damage of Alzheimer's, but it's pretty clear now that all those drugs failed. And I want to write a story about the Wild West of Alzheimer's. And the reason I'm bringing that up in the context of your question is there are other theories out there that might work, which have been blocked by all this attention to this one theory. But the point there is, there are tens of billions of dollars sitting there ready to be spent. I don't know of that many technologies out there that are that focused on, say, that one disease. And we know enough about it now. They may all fail, but it's partly the focus and the resources being put on it. Now, I also have to give a caveat that biology is incredibly difficult to understand and very complicated. And in some ways, building a machine, when humans build a machine, they know how it works because they built it. It's easier in some ways to work on these machines. But I think it's more diffuse, and I don't know where we're going to focus that kind of resources on one area like we're doing now on like cancer or Alzheimer's.
Okay, well, folks, whether it's life sciences or AI and robotics, there's a lot going on here shortly, and so hang on for the ride. So let's open it up to everybody here. Okay, we got some folks throwing their arms up here, but what we want to do is, do we have could Sam, yeah, wait for the mic. Sam, could you run it? Sorry. Hey, do we have it in the back there? I have it ready. Is it ready? Yes. Can we give it? All right. Folks, can I see who has questions? I'm just trying to look at, got the questions there. Okay. All right. But let's start here. He had his hand up first.
Okay, I'm interested in two areas of concern. One, like you see in Star Trek, since everything refers to Star Trek, you have the doctor there, which is a photonic robot, the hologram. And the idea is that they've programmed all these different cultures and all to make a perfect doctor, which is in a sense an artificial intelligence. Do you think that, and always the debate is, can there be morality programmed into him, or ethics, and what do you think about the possibility of that option? And then the other thing is that I have a friend who has MS, and I keep saying to him, why don't you look into getting some kind of artificial suit that would allow you to? Do you think that there will be nanobots that can correct that and augment in effect, miniature intelligences that can fix and correct these problems with nerve endings destroying themselves?
Yeah, I mean, on the ethics and morality question, I mean, it's interesting how Star Trek, the Doctor is always in whichever Star Trek, show you're on. He or she is always an important element, but it's the human that's the one that's giving you all the empathy. The computer voices, and even in the sick bay or any place else, it's always so funny how they're so robotic. Hello, yes. How would you like your tea?
You're not the doctor in Voyager.
Yeah, well, that's true. Okay, yes.
The Doctor in Voyager.
That's right, but he has to learn that. He starts out being somewhat robotic. And that's interesting because that's an early case of machine learning, I guess, before we even had that term. I mean, that's what, the 24th century? 300 years from now, who knows what we're going to have. You would hope if the technology continues, and I mean, look, we all want a Star Trek universe. I mean, that's the utopic view, and it's hard to find other examples in television and film, really. But that would be wonderful. I mean, I don't know if we'll be able to do that or not, but it is interesting that the people that wrote, Star Trek, and I guess continue to write it, they do have a human, though, that really is the focal point of healthcare, and pretty much in all the areas.
Well, it gets into that augmentation thing again, though. But I mean, it's like, I can imagine there'll always be a human, or could always be a human, in these kind of high-touch situations, but it'd be augmented by an insane amount of AI intelligence behind them. I mean, I think that's right.
Yeah, and the nano. You want to talk about
in the back there too? Yeah.
Nanobots for a second?
Oh, sorry, I forgot about that.
Yeah. Nanotech is so new and early, and it's actually, most people really mean macrotech, because nanotech is so small. It'd be difficult to design anything that small that would be, have the components in it to do much, at least with any kind of foreseeable current technology. But where I thought you were going was more the exoskeletons. Yeah, I mean, those are happening. That's a field that I need to go back and revisit that, because it looked like it was really going places about 10 years ago, and it hasn't really. And I know the military is working on it, but you know what I mean by that. If you saw Avatar, those big suits that those guys got in, they were walking, blah, blah. Those are giant exoskeletons, but. Right now they have technologies where you can strap on these machines that basically help you walk if you can't walk. They're really clunky, they barely work. Some people are thinking about, like the military, using them because you can jump higher, you can carry heavier loads, things like that. I know that's happening, at least in an experimental way. But so far, it hasn't really gotten to the point where it would be a good solution for your friend, unfortunately.
Okay, the one in the back there.
I have two questions for you that maybe evolved from watching too much Black Mirror, but the first one...
I'm glad we went from Star Trek to Black Mirror, that's great.
My first one is, what's your opinion on the uncanny valley issue, phenomena in robot production? You don't want a robot to look too human because it freaks you out. That's the uncanny valley. And the second is, what's your opinion about scientists making robots? I remember having a conversation with a scientist involved with a lab that's putting teeth into chickens because they can, and isn't that cool? But chickens are jerks, and the amount of terror that it emanated from me with the idea of chickens that can hurt you was large. So, scientists do things because it's neat, and we can. So that
is kind of a theme in the book. It's, again, the narrator's a bit obnoxious, and he's not very happy about the notion that you just build something because you can and because it's cool. And unfortunately, I've lived in California, Northern California, the last 22 years. I just moved to Boston, but that's been my milieu, and I get into trouble sometimes. I wrote a book on life extension, and all these people that want to live forever invited me to their meetings, not having read the book. And I get there and I go, well, there's maybe some issues around this, and they're stunned that you would ever say this isn't the coolest thing ever, and so that's a real thing. Although I think we're having a very interesting reversal of fortune for that way of thinking right now, at least with social media. I mean, really, 3 years ago, there was a cover of Vanity Fair with Mark Zuckerberg, and they were wondering if he was going to run for president. I mean, he was like the superhero. And we can see where, well, a year later, Wired had an issue of him looking like he'd been beat up in the boxing ring. He had Band-Aids on and bruises. So, that's kind of what happens when we overcool these things. And about the human appearance, I know a couple of people who advise Westworld, and that's obviously a discussion they've had. And I'm not familiar with that Black Mirror episode. I need to watch more of that. But Westworld, it's of course a huge issue, and because it's so dark and dystopic in how the robots are treated. In that universe, anyway, they decided that they couldn't look exactly human. They look really human, but not exactly, because then you wouldn't act the way you would, because it looked like another human.
But it's not just fiction. I remember reading about it with those little bots that help you. Can I help you on any, like your telephone question, and the little bot shows up. They made it so that they have to look like not human, so you really realize you're not talking to a human. I think there's even legal issues, at least in California, not here yet, where a bot has to identify itself as a bot, so you're not fooled into thinking it's a person, but it also freaks you out if it looks like a person when the little creature talking to you looks like a person.
I haven't heard that. That's fascinating.
Oh.
Because we deal with basically AI programs and automated systems all the time, and I haven't ever had like you call in to pretty much any company or airline reservations or anything. Those are that's essentially AI that's answering. I've never had one. Yeah.
Unless they identify themselves.
Yeah. I mean, we kind of know they're automated, but I've never had one.
You do, but
Yeah.
do you think average Joe Schmo knows that? That's the problem.
No, I think it's interesting. I mean, I hadn't really thought of it, actually. I think it's a fascinating question. But I do know a lot of robot designers have spent a lot of time on this question. And like a lot of the robots you will actually see, there's one called Pepper. And Pepper is a Japanese robot. I believe it's a Japanese company, or at least their technology. And it's about this high. It's intentionally made to look kind of like a child. I mean, it's got these big eyes, and I always thought that, when I started seeing, these childlike robots, that it's not going to be HAL 9000 with the red circle or the Terminator. The Terminator is going to look like this little childlike robot with big eyes, and it's not going to be scary with red glowing eyes.
So that's horrifying.
Yeah. But I was at a company the other day that it's in stealth, so I can only tell you a little bit about it. But they're developing these small robots about this size, these little cute. And this is a great company because it's to help kids who are autistic, interact with humans better. And as far as I can tell, it's an excellent idea, and they're working with a lot of autism experts. And when this goes live in about a year, we'll see how it works. But that sounds pretty interesting. But I was having discussions with the inventors and who, by the way, come from the gaming industry and from the robotics industry, and they got tired of manipulating people through. One of these guys is a big deal game designer, through games for basically just making you stay in the game and buy more stuff for the game. And we talked about how they could be designing very manipulative technology for other uses other than trying to help kids. So, but that's partly how the look of the robot is a very important part of all of that. And there's a lot of work and effort and money being spent trying to understand, what kind of interface, visual interface these robots should use.
There were some questions here. Oh, do we get that? Why don't we, you had a question? Yeah. And then we'll get to those other folks.
This was a great discussion. I am curious, can you predict the year that we'll go fully into robotics, like that AI will transform us? And second question is, do you think media has played a part into creating fear into people thinking that AI might be a problem?
Good question.
Yeah, I'll answer the first question first. And I don't really have a crystal ball to be able to do that. That's one of the reasons that I made it all up in the book, because I don't. And by the way, I got tired of reading there's a lot of great books out there, nonfiction books about robots and AI, but they all kind of end the same, which is we don't know. And I thought I would at least give some stories, some ideas that are based on historical trajectories of technology, and different scenarios. So it's, in the book there, like we said, in some cases it turns out okay, sometimes not so much, but it depends on who you ask as well. One of the chapters is called Matrix Spot, and it's not the Matrix in the movie, but this is Tim O'Reilly of O'Reilly Media, who's actually, I think, spoken at Reinvent
In San Francisco.
Yeah, in San Francisco. And Tim has also been called the Oracle of Silicon Valley, because he just sort of has this great sense of knowing what's about to happen. And he's also, he's certainly not a pessimist and he's not a dystopian, but he's a lot more realistic, I guess I put it that way, than a lot of the people that are in the hype cycles out in Silicon Valley. And I asked him what kind of robot he would want to meet or not meet, and his was the Matrix Spot, because he thinks we're actually, in a way, already there, that we're living inside of these different matrices. Like every time you order an Uber or Airbnb, you're essentially putting yourself into a matrix of AI and robots that are, you communicate with them, they communicate with the driver, they tell the driver where to go. It's all being mediated by AI. So, I don't think that you were thinking about maybe like this year as being the year, but in some ways we're there. And again, compared to even 20 years ago, 50 years ago, that would be crazy. That would be sci-fi to tell people. And we don't feel like we're being controlled by AI, and we're really not. I mean, Uber, these systems are all still pretty. They're not stupid, but they're not as smart as they might be, or they're certainly not as smart as they've been depicted in fictional accounts. But I think it's an ongoing thing. I don't think there's one year where there may be. I mean, maybe in the future we'll look back and say, okay, that was the year. But we tend to not really know in some ways because they sneak up on us. But what was the second question?
The media.
Oh, the media.
I mean, I had a...
Why don't you answer that? You're from the media.
Well, no, I would add to your thing, which is, it seems to me there's a preponderance of negativity, which is, I think, what you were saying about the future around this topic. And I'd also be interested in, why do you think that is? Like, why aren't we doing amazing stories about awesome stuff about AI? It's almost always negative.
Well, I would argue that we get both. I mean, again,
Okay.
there's the hype cycles, there's the scary cycles, and it's almost like there's a yo-yo that happens. I mean, in my area in genomics in the 90s, as the Human Genome Project was coming to an end in the late 90s, everybody was talking about, I mean, it could not have been more positive. It's like, oh my God, we're about to solve this, the secrets of life, the code of life, and everybody's going to have a credit card with their genome on it in 5 years, and you're going to take it to your doctor, and they'll be able to fix everything. There'll be new drugs, and so that hype cycle, the positive happens a lot, and often really premature. But then it's almost like the media collectively is setting it up then to fail.
Okay,
Because
I kind of took it a different way. I was thinking that our visions of the future around technology, which is more like movies and books, and that thing tends to be more negative. I think you're right. I guess when you talk about the today's,
Well, there's a tech press.
there is an up and down thing. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you were,
I'm a
you were the managing editor of Wired.
Right,
I mean,
right,
Wired invented
right.
this.
I guess
in
I'm
some
thinking
ways.
about more the future. The future visions, I think, are almost always freaky. Not always, but the big picture looks like. You
Yeah,
know,
I
think
mean-
think about robotics. You know,
Is this working?
oop,
Hello?
is that working? Did you hit it?
Did I hit it?
Anyhow, we should go on to another. While we're solving that, let's hear this other question here. Do you want to stand up and introduce yourself?
Sure. Ben Aldred with PLGG Consulting. So I just had a question around robotics. It connects a little bit with the previous question and a little bit with sort of how we're viewing the role of AI, but also some of the more technical realization of robotics. And so my sense was that in several conversations I've heard that our understanding initially was a little bit, robotics are going to advance faster than our ability to program them, and that thinking is somewhat reversed, and that almost the underlying software AI is whatever systems may be smarter than our ability to deliver biomechanical type robotic realizations in the world. So I'd just be curious kind of where you're seeing that innovation happening, where you're seeing gaps, and just your perspective there.
Could you run that mic to him right here as we're going, while we swap out the battery?
I think we have to, get technologies like microphones down
First.
before I download my brain into a computer.
Exactly.
Yeah. I missed the beginning of what you said because we were fooling with the mics, but
Basically, the idea that originally people thought that the software was going to be the hurdle, and now they're thinking maybe the hardware is the hurdle.
Yeah.
Sort of where you're seeing innovation in the hardware and where you're seeing gaps in the hardware.
thanks. I have to admit, I mean, I'm not a big expert on that, and the ins and outs of it. But my sense is that you have this hurry up and wait in both. I mean, I remember when computers couldn't possibly store all of the data they needed to store, and now we kind of solved that problem, or at least we did. I don't know. I don't have a lot of insight into that. So, sorry.
Why don't you grab this? No, you keep that one, and you use this one for the thing. Okay, there's actually, right, we'll get to you in a minute. Right here, behind you? No, I was thinking right here. Yeah, Isaac. What's that? No, we need this mic for the live stream, right, to pick up? Oh, okay. Okay. Sorry about that. Okay.
Thank you for really interesting talk. I was interested on the more on, I guess, on the AI than robotics. I also find fascinating. I've been reading Nick Bostrom book, Philosopher of Mind, on it's called Superintelligence, and he talks a lot about seed AIs and kind of their growth in the iterative process to make more advanced AIs, and they all kind of seem to have they seem to go sour in a lot of ways, at least on humanity. So the thought was, at least in my mind, is in terms of like guardrails for AI, what would that be would it be the engineer, or would it be an adversarial AI to kind of keep the AI within boundaries? Or
Well, that's such a fascinating question. We sort of touched on that in different ways, but one idea is that the AI actually is the one that decides like how it's programmed and who does the programming, and it's learned from multiple sources how. I mean, you mentioned guardrails. That's a fascinating way to talk about it. But this may even be partly an answer to over here. The question for me really is, are we even thinking about this enough at the software level? Where the coders and the people that are actually writing about these things. I mean, Nick Bostrom and Max Tegmark, who I know, write about this a lot. But Max is more of an engineer, but it's an interesting philosophical question. Who decides these things and who writes them? But meanwhile, the coders are off writing code. And I don't know if it's software or hardware. I mean, probably more software. But we're getting into some trouble now with social media because you had one group of people, basically, white guys and some non-white guys, but writing the base code for social media. And these are very smart guys, but they don't get out much. And a lot of them, I would argue, still don't fundamentally believe that there are bad guys out in the world that are trying to take advantage of the software and to hack in. And so, we're still trying to sort it out right now with what we have. And maybe we will. I mean, again, I was surprised myself, by the way, about being more optimistic in the book than I thought I might be. I consider myself fairly optimistic, but when you look at some of these problems, like what I was just talking about, how do we get out of the base code being written by people that really didn't understand how it could be abused? And we're still fighting that, but historically we have been able to work out most of those things eventually. The question is how powerful are all these technologies, and will that learning curve, be steep enough before real problems are caused?
Yeah, that's where we got a couple questions here, but I want to do one shout out to, there's a Vanity Fair writer here who did one of the best pieces on this book that's floating out there right now. If you want to link and give people the most condensed and best kind of distillation of the piece of the book, that's it. In fact, if you have a follow-up question, we'd love to give you the mic at some point here too. But let's start with you. Go ahead.
Hi, Peter Andrews. I'm curious to your view on AI and robotics as far as the government's concerned with labor. Like, in other words, this company you're going to be at 20% robotics and you're at 24. Like labor laws being robotics and AI being infused with labor laws. In countries like ours or totalitarian regimes, how are they going to fare?
So what?
Basically,
could you see legal constraints on how many robots you could use?
Constraints.
How many what?
How much displacement of labor of real humans you'd get?
Yeah, I think we'll see that for sure. I mean, again, we have basically full employment right now, so it's nobody's really thinking about it. But yeah, I mean, if any almost all predictions now are pointing towards automation happening faster than we can replace jobs, say in the next 30 years, and it will be interesting. I mean, the politics will play a huge role. And again, I'm not, I think we all need to think about what role the government should play, what role we should collectively, or how collectively we should deal with these issues.
Although you see smaller governments like dictatorships being more ahead of us because they can just outline stuff and say this is the way it is.
It depends on what you mean by ahead of us. He asked about dictatorships being ahead of us.
As far as playing,
I mean, they're certainly ahead of us in certain things like surveillance, and spying and
robotics and AI.
yeah. Well, I mean, the question is, more authoritative governments, are they even thinking about the impact on lost workers, other than to keep them happy enough that they don't revolt? And that's an issue even in our society.
So like Paraguay, for example, kids are learning how to code, where things that rarely happens.
Yeah.
There is, I will say, one of the best books besides this book on AI and robotics is AI Superpowers by Kai-Fu Lee, who it came out last year, but he really looks at what's going on in China, your authoritarian kind of model there, of just how they will surpass essentially the U.S. and Silicon Valley in the AI space for a bunch of reasons, not the least of which is channeling an insane amount of money into it, but also because they have no limits on, or very few limits on privacy and siloed information and insane amounts of data, which is really what AI needs, is as much data as possible, makes it better and better and faster. So anyhow, it's an interesting discussion about whether the liberal democracies, human rights kind of defended countries will be able to keep up with someone that, another kind of regime that would just kind of put the pedal to the metal and go. Can we get, do we have the camera? Yeah, we're going to get to him too. But let's just keep mixing it from different sides of the room here.
I'm really tall, so I won't stand, but I hope you can see me with my hair. I'm Camilla Barungi. I have an advisory where I basically build innovation and culture bridges between Africa and the rest of the world. We just wrapped the Africa 4.0 Summit in Kampala, Uganda. And we actually had Sophia. She couldn't come because of Ebola, supposedly. I didn't know robots get sick, but she teleconferenced and
Tell everybody who Sophia is if they don't know.
a humanoid robot from Hanson Robotics. But we basically, we are a billion people, poorest people, diseased. But basically, this is the first time that Africa is literally on the same front lines of an industrial revolution with the rest of the world. And we are learning about robotics. We are training kids in robotics. All the big tech companies, Facebook, Google, all in Africa. I actually wanted to pick up on a conversation that you and I had when I was signing the book, that you've actually traveled from Cape Town to Cairo by bicycle, you said, which is crazy. You're nuts. But
Young and stupid.
yeah. But within this context of Africa and other people really concerned about, I feel as American as I am African, them versus us, what's going on in the rest of the world, like, should we be scared? Also, the meter, like, whereas you talk about the love and the fear meter, which we have here, they don't really have a fear meter. They have nothing to lose. They're like, bring it on, like, love, love, love. Like, it can't get any worse than this, right? So in terms of, like, the context of Africa and this whole story, because I feel like the conversation that we're really having is really US-based. How do you see this bridge between this robotics story, between the US and the developing world, and how can we merge? What I've seen that's coming out of, like, 4IR technologies in Africa, because they have completely different problems. They're not so much worried about who's listening to them, like, okay, whatever, like, listen to me all day long. They're coming up with, like, really solutions around, like, solving their day-to-day problems. Like, can you give me some context there? That'll be.
Well, yeah, no, it's fascinating, and it goes back to my time when I was a correspondent in Africa, and I continue to visit a lot. I mean, we can't get too, and I'm glad you brought this up, because we can't get too crazy about these advanced technologies, AI, and we're talking about this crazy future wherever it will go, when much of the world is still, needing the most basic technologies. And I haven't written about this recently, and I should write about it again more, but there's low tech as well as high tech. And high tech can inform low tech, and it can be used to organize it. I mean, there's some great ways that you can use AI to organize resources more effectively. There's some weather issues, the Sahel, getting bigger, or the desert getting bigger in the Sahel. Some of these sophisticated weather programs could help a lot with that, and they should be applied better. But really, and I wrote a bunch of stories, this is 20 years ago, but about high-tech solutions coming into places that needed low-tech solutions. And they ended up, kind of backfiring if you didn't. Nothing wrong with high tech, and it should be distributed. And that goes for our country too. I mean, in every country really. I mean, a lot of people who are especially struggling a little bit, with some basic aspects of life. What we're talking about here is a pretty esoteric discussion for most of the world.
Well, but the other thing though I would say about it, which I think is a really good discussion, because for example, we're working out about, do we want AI to be our doctors, right? And it's kind of like, well, do I really want to let go of my human doctor who gives me all this attention or something? But the thing is, if you didn't have doctors, and you had an app that was super cheap, you could scale it like insanely, and whatever you get there, you might not get your hand held the same way, but you got expert advice on, that rash on your face because the video camera can pick it up or whatever. It also seems incredibly powerful that these AI things, I think we kind of lose track of it a little bit because we're getting wigged out on privacies and empathy, and is it going to be empathetic enough? But on the other hand, it's super scalable, super smart, and super cheap, essentially, compared to our crazy costly healthcare systems we've built.
Well, that's a case of taking AI, which is sort of driving those systems, and it's not that phones are low tech, but the basic phones that you now find all over the world, and very cheaply, and it's an extraordinary device because when I was originally in Africa, you didn't have that at all. I mean, you were completely isolated, but that's a case where you can use some of the AI in health protocols, these systems that are trying to be developed, and I won't get into gory detail about that. It's still a ways away from really working for a lot of interesting reasons, mostly around the complexity of human beings. But yeah, I mean, telemedicine is becoming huge, and it's not always done very well. It's sometimes done by healthcare systems trying to save money, and they kind of slough it off to these literally robots on sticks. I wasn't kidding about that. Those things, they roll around. If they will stop and not run into you, so they have some sensors. But it's basically a video screen on a stick with wheels. And in some cases, that can be powerful. Especially if there's something visual going on with somebody, like a rash or something that they can see. Because there's a doctor who's on the screen, and he or she can see, through a camera what's going on. And it can be incredible. It's interesting too. There's some studies that needs to be more research done on this that suggest that people actually like that. I mean, it's not a lack of empathy, despite the little image I put up. Always, if the doctor on the screen, it's a real human and it's talking to them, and even though it's on a screen, there's a kind of moment where the first time people are a little set back, like, where's the human? Why am I looking at this guy on a TV? But as soon as they start interacting, it's not that bad. And by the way, that's not super high tech. That's putting a video screen on a stick. So, my point before was just that we tend to, in meetings like this, go crazy over all the really complex stuff out there in the future when there are a lot of present day problems that don't need that level of complexity or money spent on them. They do need money spent on them, but not at the level of these crazy new technologies.
All right, we got one. Oh, we got two questions actually, and then we're going to slip. Oh, they're popping up here, but we do have. He's going to be hanging out here. We're going to have food and drink coming out here, but let's do a quickie here, and then I offered that one question from the back, and we got one. So give it. What's your?
Ian Barber. I hear you making this dichotomy between the AI, the mechanical side of things and biotechnology, and the use of DNA as digital storage is the first thing that comes to mind. I'm sure many people have heard the statistic that you could take all the world's data existing today and put it on about 5 grams of DNA. And Microsoft actually has a viable experiment going using DNA as a storage medium. And to what you said before about the need for vast amounts of storage to really, power AI, what do you think will happen when we can take that much data and put it in such a small spot, mobile, on its own? I mean, is that where they become alive? Is that I'd like to hear your take.
Well, it's not really alive, just the DNA itself, but it's like the software for life, or the programming for life. That's a decent analogy, but well, it's being done right now. It's cost really. The gentleman I mentioned earlier that's in the book, George Church, that does the synthetic biology, he's been a leader in this field, and he took a book he wrote called Regeneration, and they actually turned it into DNA. And DNA is just code. It's the 4 letters, and they actually use the double helix, phosphate sugar superstructure that you see that shape. That's what, and the DNA is, the nucleotides are embedded in that, and we now know that can last. They found intact DNA 700 million years old. So, in the right place, you need to store it in kind of a dry, cool place. But yeah, it kind of lasts indefinitely. And the problem right now is it's enormously expensive because you're having to build, these little stretches of DNA. And DNA, there's miles of it in every cell you have, but it's so thin that it breaks very easily. So there's some sort of structural issues there. But George is also, he put a movie on it. He actually put an old silent movie, it's a very short one, but he converted it to DNA and then converted it back and to digital and then showed the film. And so yeah, it's fantastically expensive and complicated, especially to bring it back. actually coding it is not, because they do that a lot. You know, they can build these codes of stretches of DNA. But converting it back is the hard part. But if you could ever do that, I mean, you know, what is it, 6% of electricity in the US is from storage?
Yeah.
Computer storage or something?
Yeah.
And with the
And
carbon,
growing.
yeah, the carbon footprint that, I mean, this would be pretty extraordinary to, you know, on a lot of fronts.
It's so trippy. Everything's so trippy. We're going to have the last question here. I know there's other questions we can ask, but Mary Alice, I promised you get the last word in here.
So kind of you. Thank you for such a great talk. My question is about language and teaching AI and robots. So there was someone earlier who asked a question about when those smart icons came to be, you know, like Microsoft Word, Clippy. Does everyone remember Clippy? That little icon that would help. And I remember, you know, the fun thing to do was to teach it dirty words, right? Like that's what everybody did with Microsoft Clippy. And then with AOL Instant Messenger, we had Smarter Child. I don't know if anyone remembers Smarter Child, but you wanted to get Smarter Child to say dirty things, and in some cases, people taught it to say hateful things. And when we got Siri, it was like, oh, Siri, where's the best place to hide a dead body? That was the whole thing. And then you start getting ads for shovels and things like that. My question is, we know how to teach AI dirty things, hateful things. We've seen that sort of taken to the extreme with some language on 4chan, for instance, that comes out with people in the alt-right movement. Maybe that's off on a little tangent. But what questions should we be asking AI to teach it how to love?
That's actually something I would love to hear from everybody, because I think, you know, it's an open question on, you know, how would you even program it? You know, we were saying, it's a computer right now, an AI system, a robot, doesn't feel love. It doesn't feel, I mean, it doesn't really have the capacity to do that like we do. It's not, you might be able to have it mimic love or mimic ethics or morality. We still, you know, again, we don't really even understand these things in ourselves entirely. You know, in our own ethical structure, we often know what seems ethical or not. You know, we often think we know anyway what love is or not. But, you know, how are we going to program that into a computer as we're trying to figure it out ourselves? But these are the kind of questions that, it was so much fun to write this book, because I got to actually sit back and think a little bit about this, and you know, how these technologies, again, they're not quite there yet. We're not really ready to, you know, tell Alexa about love, and I'm sure there's some pat answers that they programmed in if you ask her, or I don't know, is it her?
Oh, sure, it's her.
Yeah, which is a whole other question.
Oh, I see, yeah.
Yeah. But, you know, I'm sure she will have a ready answer if you ask her, you know, what is love? What do you think is love? But Alexa's not feeling that. There's no sense of love like we would sense it. And, you know, as we're winding up here, I think that's a good kind of example of what we have to keep in mind, especially as these systems become so much more human-like. And they are designing, you know, again, this little Pepper. Pepper is the cutest thing on the planet. It's right now, it's in some hotels and restaurants. It'll actually greet you like the maitre d'. Say, would you like a table? And, you know, here's the menu. And, you know, it's this cutest, it's like a little kid. Yeah, hi. And you love this little robot. But it's designed to be loved. And it certainly doesn't understand love. It doesn't know that you're loving it.
And with that, we see the food coming in with humans here. Let's give a big
thank you.
Thanks to David. Stay around. We got food, drink, companionship. David's here, and thanks again, everybody.
Can I get a picture?
Sure.